Hello, and welcome to the Gaia update for the Venus retrograde happening May-June 2020. I'm Adrienne Elise. So Venus is in Gemini, taking a retrograde starting on May 13th and then turning direct on June 25th. So let's talk this through. This means that Venus will stay in Gemini from April 4th until August 7th. 4 months of Venus in Gemini. So what does this mean? Well, Venus is a personal planet. It means that it affects our everyday life. It is what makes us feel, it represents our feminine side, and what makes us feel good, what makes us feel safe, what makes us feel loved, what we love, what we value. It's also speaks to our self-worth and how we see ourselves in the world, in our level of value within and what we value from without. So in Gemini is a mutable sign. It's mutable air. So air is kind of all over the place anyway. So Gemini has Venus and Gemini taking a retrograde is kind of saying that there may be some confusion going on about what we really want, what we really care about, what we really need, and basically just our whole orientation to who we really are on a core level. Now, this very much fits the world situation right now, where our whole lives have been turned upside down. So it kind of fits in a way, in a very uncomfortable way, of having to question and reevaluate our core values. Now, Gemini has an energy. Gemini is the twins, okay? And it represents an energy of mental, because it's air sign, and it's ruled by Mercury. Mercury represents our mind, our mental concept. So Gemini always wants to try to figure things out, right? And so Venus retrograde in Gemini is kind of an uncomfortable place because Venus doesn't really want to think about things. Venus wants to feel and to have sensation and move into things in that way. So, but Venus is being asked to reevaluate her whole existence and our whole existence on this planet, really, because Gemini represents trying to come to truth of things, trying to come to clarity, overcoming the duality of the twins, right? So the war of the mind and the emotions, the war of the right and the left, the war of the male and the female, the war of our intellectual thinking and our creative thinking, and using that duality to come back into a place of oneness and understanding. But understanding in this confusing time on our planet is rather elusive. And that is exactly the energy of this Venus retrograde. So kind of expect over this next couple of months to not really know who you are, what you're doing, and why. And maybe that's giving us a huge opportunity, because it's like, as much as we're trying to get back to normal, it's a new normal. We've had such a deep jarring of the way our life usually is. People being forced to go within and be with themselves and to get down to the basics of life and what really matters. So we can't just step out into the world and have it be the way it was. There's really good positive things and healing ability, energies and opportunities here, but it's also incredibly disconcerting and uncomfortable. And this is exactly what this Venus retrograde is speaking to. Because Gemini wants to come to truth, it's so analytical, it wants to understand, there is an opportunity with this Venus retrograde to come to greater truth and understanding within. But the greater truths and understandings that are available to us are about our core level values, what matters to us, what makes us feel good, and what we really care about, and our own self-worth, right? Now, so it's interesting because we have in Taurus, just one sign over from Gemini, the ruler, Venus is the ruler of Taurus, right? And we got Uranus and Taurus trying to bring a new higher frequency, radical shifting energy to these issues of Venus, of our self-worth. So ultimately, this whole Venus retrograde in Gemini is really about that Uranus and Taurus in a way, around our radical shift in self-worth and our big change in our conceptual reality and how we see the world and what we think is true and what makes us feel good is on the table. So let's kind of talk this through in a timeline. Venus went into its retrograde shadow April 10th. So the energy already happened, pretty much when Venus moved into Gemini on the 4th of April. It's kind of like, okay, here we go. We've got our 4 months of Venus in Gemini. And Venus is like rules earth sign, but it also rules Libra, an air sign. So it can try to become comfortable here in all of these thoughts and ideas of Gemini and these conceptual journeys. But it does feel rather dry for Venus. Venus kind of wants to get into sensation and feeling and out of the mind. And yet here we are. It's like we're stuck in the mind until we can make some really big shifts and changes in our perception of reality that have to do with our value system, have to do with the whole overhaul of the structures of our world, because this is happening during this Pluto and Jupiter conjunction. It's very interesting because this Venus retrograde happens, it begins, the energy starts while Jupiter and Pluto are close. And then Jupiter and Pluto stay close, but not exact. So they're in an exact conjunction kind of at the beginning of this Venus retrograde. And then at the end of this Venus retrograde, they have their next conjunction, Jupiter and Pluto. So Jupiter brings an energy of expansion and growing more and more of whatever it comes into contact with. It's rather neutral in itself. It kind of brings light and attention and expansion energies. So Pluto and Capricorn, exposing the dysfunctions of the structures of our world, bringing light to corruption, bringing light to the fact that our structures of our world, financial, educational, health, religions, spiritual, everything of our world is old and draconian and doesn't fit the Aquarian age, right? Like these structures can't serve us in the new. And that's why they've got to break down. And it also Capricorn speaks to authority structures. It's about us owning our own power and ourself, our authority, our expertise. Capricorn is about bringing forward the gifts that you have, like an expression of you and your apex of experience in your life. And also represents, though, where we've given our power away to external authorities. And of course, that's what got us into this mess with all these structures that don't fit who we are, humanity. And we are at a place where we can't go forward until we adjust these things. So the next piece, that's interesting because right at the beginning of this Venus retrograde, about a week before and a little over a week before Venus turns retrograde, Pluto turned retrograde. And so Pluto's kind of like pushing for these structural changes, because Pluto is like the destroyer. It's like a wrecking ball, but it's not just about destroying. It's about rebuilding in a better way, right? But we're definitely in the destructo place. It's like very hard and very disconcerting. And that's exactly what this Venus retrograde feels like. So just at the very beginning, a week or two before this Venus turns retrograde, we've got Pluto turning retrograde. And so it's kind of like Pluto's had it coming off with that pressure of pushing forward with these changes. And it's telling us that this Venus retrograde represents the change, what needs to happen for us to continue moving forward with the destruction, but also the positive changes that need to happen in our world. So what needs to happen for us to move forward? Massive shift in our constructural reality of what is true. I mean, Venus retrograde in Gemini is like a complete rearranging of our mind and value system and personal self-worth system. And because Gemini is a mutable sign. So the mutable signs happen at the change of seasons, right? And the mutable signs are kind of like adjusting. How do we adjust? So in Gemini, it's adjusting the mind and adjusting our relationship to the other, right? Our relationship to those forces and relationships in the world that work against us or that we come up against in order to learn and grow. It represents like the sibling dynamic, right? And those relationships that come at that point in our life of negotiating our boundaries, our personal boundaries, and our permission to have our own identity, and how relationships serve to, of course, help us grow in this spiritual evolution that we're in. So very powerful energy, but definitely this Venus retrograde is saying this is what's required for humanity to move forward into this new age, is a complete rearranging of our values in relationship to truth, conceptual reality, and our mind. So, wow. Now, the thing that flavors this Venus retrograde in this huge way and makes it so intensely uncomfortable, but also a beautiful opportunity, is that Venus squares up with Neptune 3 times. So it's actually flavors the whole retrograde because it happens right before. Venus turns retrograde at 21 degrees Gemini. Neptune is hanging out in new territory at 20 degrees Pisces. So that's a square because Pisces is also a mutable sign. And so, of course, Venus is the ruler of Pisces, and we're speaking to issues a lot that are coming on the table right now around the Piscean age. And Neptune rules spiritual revelation and a connection, direct connection to God, and a direct connection to source and life and the bigger picture, the oneness principle, but also how that oneness principle and spiritual energies have been used to control humanity in this Piscean age. So a lot of delusions, right? And that's part of the energy of this Venus retrograde. Like, say, just an example that's coming to mind is like religious leaders that we've been taught we could trust the most. These are the most pure, the most high, right? And then what if we realize that they've been running a pedophilia network, right? It's like, ooh, that's the rearranging that's going on with this Venus retrograde. And it's really going to some dark and uncomfortable places. So Venus squares up with Neptune the first week of May, right before it turns retrograde. And, but now and then the second Venus square Neptune happens exact in the 20th to the 22nd of April. So what this means is that of May, the whole month of May is this energy of Venus square Neptune. And it's the whole energy of this Venus retrograde. It's not going to resolve until we get a few months down the road. But this is the energy of May. So that first week of May, Venus comes in, even though it's not retrograde yet, it's deep in its retrograde shadow, her retrograde shadow, and coming into that square with Neptune. So squares have an energy of tension, right? Like what needs to be adjusted? What needs to change? Because the way you're going, there's no way there. Right? You've got to turn. It's a 90-degree turn. And so this 90-degree turn has to do with these delusions of the Piscean age, delusions around our self-worth, delusions around our value, humans, the value of humans. So this is an interesting energy coming up with this because there's kind of an agenda, a dark agenda on our planet that's kept us as slaves, like farming our precious life force energy, while kind of keeping us as sheep or as sheeple or as kind of like feeders, lower life forms, right? And we're actually the source. Like this whole, control energy matrix is fed on our energy. So it's up to us to decide to stop feeding it. And that's a very important process that's happening individually, especially in these soul groups, of like recognizing the precious life force inside of you, recognizing where you've given it away to toxic relationships that were about actually keeping you down and interfering with your purpose and your path and your sense of self, right? And then taking that energy back into you and enjoying that energy for yourself. And it's hard because when you first do that, you feel deeply lonely and isolated. It's almost like, well, who am I if I'm not feeding the monster? Because that's all I've done for lifetimes and it's all I know. I thought that was love, right? And then the tentacly attachments come and be like, this is the only way you can get. It's like, it's like this toxic love, but, this is all you get. So you're going to just take what you can get, the toxic crumbs, right? And it's like, until we say no to those patterns and stop leaking out our power to those energies, we can never move on into the new paradigm, into our soul groups and that deep spiritual connection we're all looking for in relationships. So it's a powerful time for big shifts in relationships. That's always the deal with Venus retrograde. You know, Venus ultimately represents love, what makes us feel good, and how we relate interpersonally in our life. And so Venus retrogrades will typically bring back into your life old partners, right? And bring back old love patterns and I thought I dealt with this, right? You know, so that's just kind of part of Venus retrograde, going back into old relationship patterns. But for these souls and for humanity right now, one by one, it's giving us this opportunity to be like, oh yeah, I see you. No, right? The answer is no, because I'm willing now to hold this new self-worth, this precious energy available to me that I've worked for over lifetimes, the spiritual gift that I am. I'm going to hold this precious, and I'm going to make sure that anybody who comes near me is also willing to hold that precious. And so it goes from this give and take war-based relationships of feeding the dark hole of the narcissist to sharing spiritual light and love. It's like, can you let yourself conceive of that? It's a big shift. Okay, so, but that's what this is about. And so this whole month of May is got this energy of Venus square Neptune coming into the delusions of love that have to do with the bigger delusions of our world, right? So this bigger story of how our oneness consciousness, our spiritual energy of spiritual revelation, you know, because the Pisces represents what happened, the defining factor, and what happened at the beginning of the Piscean age was the Christ event, right? And the Christ event we haven't been able to even fully understand, but it all had to do with spiritual revelation of this connection of like, oh man, we're particles of God. Here we are experiencing life in our consciousness in a body. Wow, you know? And then that energy being used through religious structures, you know, to control humanity. But we've got to go back to that spiritual revelation and not lose that, because that's the key to the higher octave of the Aquarian age. And so that's the gift. There's a very uncomfortable energy with this Venus squared Neptune of having to face these delusions and where you've given your power away and where you've not had self-worth and where you thought that was love and where you've been lied to and manipulated by the people around you, and that you bought into it because, you know. And so that's the difficult part. But underneath that, this higher octave of Pisces, this, because Venus and Neptune together, because Venus is like the lower octave of love and Neptune is the higher octave of love. And so it's like a rainbow bridge, even though it's got tension to it. But tension brings us the most opportunity for change. And so for these souls, it's about, yes, I'm ready to demand and command my relationships are on a spiritual level, right? And so many of these souls I work with, it's like, it just feels elusive, like it's just not even possible to have a relationship with another human being in a body, in form, in this dimensional reality that's actually a spiritual experience. You know, these souls have been so isolated and so disconnected and so enmeshed in these lower karmic situations, right? They can't even conceive. So this is what this is about for you. And to start imagining and being in the vision and being in the revelation of spiritual relationships and demanding and commanding that that is what you're available for here. Because it's like you've committed yourself to this spiritual process. Again and again, you've been showing up, you've been doing the work. And then having this delusion that it's just not possible to connect with other people on that level. It's something you have to do all by yourself, alone, you know, in isolation. That's deep programming that goes way back in ancient times. So this is all coming unraveling, and that's where these souls need to take this opportunity to tap into that spiritual revelation of love, you know, and take the goddess Venus back to the temple and be like, yeah, this is the vibration come on, I'm here on my throne and you can come meet me here. And that's what And so maybe it does take that place we've all been for so long of feeling isolated in relationships, as far as spiritual relationships, and being like, this is the level that I am going to require. People meet me on this level in my relationships. And that requires saying no to the lower energies and being alone, being willing to be alone. But it's just temporary, right? It's just temporary. And you've been here a long time. So, we're about to turn the corner on this and connect back with our soul groups and have these like very satisfying spiritual relationships with people who don't want to go into the lower garbage, right? And where it's like, yeah, we're going to be here. We're going to meet here. And this is a spiritual revelation of love that's available. And I'm seeing a beautiful rainbow represented by these powerful soul groups that are using this opportunity to bridge our regular everyday love, relationship love that gets so dirty and messy. And that's that Cancer Capricorn axis where it's like you have to give your power away to get what you need in this life. It's always this give and take, like there's not enough. It's always one person wants it more than the other, and it's a game, and it's like, enough of that. When we're connected to our own source, it's a new paradigm in relationships. And that's actually the reason why you've had so much dysfunction in relationships is actually evidence that you have a connection to your source and they want to come feed on you, right? And so then by having the boundaries and being able to delineate and come back to your throne, bring all your energy back home, and then these souls, powerful mission in these next couple of months of bridging this and knowing it's true and living in the reality of spiritual relationships, even if they're not in the physical yet, right? And that's a huge part of the work that I'm doing here that I would like to see us do together, which we're doing, is we have to start those connections on the astral plane, right? And get a little more comfortable with even knowing these people are out there, but they are. You have a soul group, you're already working together, and yet there's so much that keeps them apart. But this is the gold of this Venus retrograde and the gift you can bring to the world right now by being that rainbow bridge of being willing to conceive and imagine and grow in your psyche, your visionary ability, your creation, your co-creation abilities, spiritualized love. So there you go. Easier said than done, right? So on the 13th of May is the big day when Venus actually turns retrograde at 21 degrees. So that's why it's like it comes into that square with Neptune at 20 degrees. Now that's cool though in a way because Neptune is just made it to 20 degrees in April, and that is like new territory for Pisces, for Neptune saying, hey, we are actually getting through into Pisces. Like this is going to happen. Like eventually Neptune will move to Aries, right? It'll be a while, but and so this new 20 degrees is kind of like, okay, really time to look at the delusions of the Piscean age and the delusions that keep us from our spiritual revelation and the knowing of that we're all connected to this oneness. And so that 20 degrees is about this 2020 vision, right? Like everything in this Venus retrograde is this 2020 vision coming out of the soup and the delusions and the distortions. And of course, it has to get more delusional before it can get more clear, apparently, right? Healing crisis. And but that's kind of this energy. And so Venus taking that retrograde on May 13th. Now, it's interesting because Saturn and Jupiter are really connected to this whole energy. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but we need to look at this because, so Venus takes that turns retrograde on the 13th of May. Saturn turns retrograde on the 11th of May. Jupiter turns retrograde on the 14th of May. So it's like Venus is sandwiched between Saturn and Jupiter also. It's like all three of them kind of going, hey, wait a minute. We're not ready to go. Because if we go this way, the way we've always gone before, we're going to end up in the same old mess, right? So expect those old relationships to come back in and be like, hey, don't you remember the good times, right? And so now Saturn and Jupiter turn direct very close to each other as well in September. And that's when Venus and Mars come back together into this trine. So the whole month of April, Venus and Mars were in very close in trine. And it's pretty interesting leading up to this Venus retrograde. Then Mars takes a retrograde in the fall. And so Venus is then, so September is important because it's like a lot of things kind of come together in September. And that's when Saturn turns direct. Jupiter turns direct September 12th. Saturn turns direct September 29th. And then somewhere in there, I think it's that first week of September or so, is when Venus and Mars come back into their trine. And it seems like that's... Mars will still be retrograde. It's just, during that time. Actually, that's right when Mars turns retrograde is September as well. But this chapter we're in right now is kind of going to go till then, and we know 2020 is just, the astrology is just so over the top. And so here we are, we need to take advantage of it and be present. And that's definitely what everything is telling us. So again, May 20th to the 22nd is when we have that second exact of Venus square Neptune. So that's going to be another squeeze of this. But now Venus will be retrograde, right? So Venus is crossing over. It crosses over that goes in that square with Neptune. Then Saturn turns retrograde, and then Venus turns retrograde, and then Jupiter turns retrograde, and then Venus comes back in to that exact square with Neptune. And like I said, until the end of May, we're feeling that energy. So it's just kind of chalk May up to, Venus square Neptune. But can we dream a new dream of spiritualized love, right? And exalt the goddess in our life to this higher octave of love. Now, around that same time, this is really interesting, Venus comes into a conjunction with Mercury in the home sign. So Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, right? So Mercury and Gemini, very, very powerful, especially after that Mercury retrograde, right? That went over, Pisces, Aquarius, Pisces, and like, how are we going to get into the Aquarian age, right? Like, nobody knows, but Mercury's trying to figure it out. Mercury's got a big task because it's like trying to be the messenger between, and that's exactly the energy of this world right now. Like, and part of the very uncomfortable feeling of this Venus retrograde and Venus square Neptune is like, things are not as they seem. Something is not right. Like, there is something going on in the world that we don't know about. Like, what's really happening, And it's because we have multiple things happening on multiple levels and timelines converging and a war of information going on. And, just very incredibly confusing and disconcerting time because humans want to know, and we don't get to know right now. And yet we do know, especially you souls, you have this spiritual connection, and it's time to claim that back because that, right? And so Venus and Mercury come together at that same exact time of the Venus square Neptune, which means Mercury also squares Neptune. So from the 20th to the 23rd of May, huge shift, like big, powerful energy, because it's the second of 3 Venus square Neptunes and Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, right there. And Mercury's kind of like, okay, come on. We're coming into council. We're going to figure this out, right? Maybe we'll get some clarity, but Venus is just starting its retrograde, so I don't know. But it's kind of like Mercury's there trying to be like, okay, enough like dancing around in the confusion. Like, what's going on here? What is this really about, But I think that could be the height of the confusion and of this, getting worse before it gets better as humanity tries to come out of the great delusion, So we'll see what that is about. Now, Venus comes into it, and we talked about that sweet Venus trine Mars, right? But Venus comes into a square with Mars as Mars moves into Pisces. So that's going to be an interesting energy, right? Because for a lot of this Venus retrograde, Mars will be in Pisces. And then Mars in Pisces is like, it's kind of like Venus in Gemini is like, oh, it's uncomfortable. Mars in Pisces is very uncomfortable too, because it's like Mars is like, let's go. And the more you put the motor on the boat in Pisces, the more you're going the wrong direction. You know, it's like trying to row a boat and you're like put too much on the one side and you go the opposite direction of where, you know, you're going in circles. It's just going in circles is the energy. And so that's pretty interesting. And they're coming into a square. So it's like, but it's like trying to come into that whole energy of Venus and Gemini is this overcoming the duality and the opposites in our culture, within our brain, right? So this is interesting because the control energies of the lower matrix started back in Atlantean time. And I've been shown very clearly an agenda from that period of time, programming around disconnecting our ability to work in our right brain and our left brain together, because that's the key to our intuitive abilities, which is the key to our spiritual freedom, right? So they can keep us in a prison planet as long as we can't connect right, left brain. So that's a very, very powerful esoteric energy of this Venus square Neptune and Venus retrograde in Gemini, right? It's like, is it time for us to overcome the programming that's kept us from our higher intuitive abilities? Right? I mean, humanity in general has had huge intuitive abilities in ancient times. And then we've got all these advanced lightworker souls that are extremely apt at telepathic communication and higher intuitive abilities, except for that there's like mass amount of control, you know, so the programming that started in Atlantean time, and then so many resources have gone into mind control of certain individuals, you know, over lifetimes. Just like so much effort being put in to keep us from this higher power. And this higher power, that means it's pretty powerful, right? And it's also, we're programmed with fear. So this is interesting, you know, that's like this coming forward. It's like, okay, this is our time to get out from the delusions around fear of our own intuitive power. Because our intuitive power is something natural to us, especially these advanced souls. You've worked with this really extremely. You know, you have abilities to do all of these things, but you just don't remember, and you've been so programmed to forget and programmed with fear, right? And the big, powerful message around this is that the only thing dangerous about your intuitive abilities, the only danger is to the lower control matrix, right? Because enough of us step over into our higher intuitive abilities, into that higher vibrational frequency, into that very powerful, true and real higher chakra activation of the crown chakra and the sixth and seventh chakra, our intuitive abilities, 6th and 7th chakra working together, pineal gland, cleaning and defragmenting and decalcifying, right? And that's like, that shifts us over into the new paradigm, and like basically that raises the frequency vibration on the planet, and the control energies can't exist in that higher vibration. That's why they've done so much over so long to hold this evolution back, right? And it's been 1,000 years too long, I think. Like maybe, you know, who knows? Atlantean time could be up to 100,000 years ago, and we've been playing out this game. Enough, right? And that's what's going on here, but it's going to require a massive shift in consciousness. And that feels like what this Gemini is, our everyday thinking consciousness. And that's what needs to change, right? And it's like, so we've got these advanced souls and they're doing this spiritual work and they're hanging out up here, but most of humanity is like right here. That's where the changes need to happen. The spiritual influx of energy needs to make it down through the lower matrix and the delusions right into our everyday mind, right? Except we're so, you know, technology and the grid and like mind control, like, so, but you holding those higher frequency vibrations and being that rainbow bridge is what you're here to do, you know, key to the process. Okay, so that Venus square Mars happens in the first week of June. And so that's going to be a shift. And then Venus comes into a conjunction with the Sun in Gemini that same day. right? So the sun and Venus will be squaring Mars. Now, the sun is like who we think we are, right? So the sun and Venus together squaring Mars is definitely speaking to this war, right? So the war between our right and left brain and disconnect is like also what keeps us from our heart consciousness, because our brain is an organ of duality, right? And it can be controlled because of that duality. Our thoughts and our psychology, right? The heart is an organ of oneness. It also has conscious cells. And that's where we need to go to move this ship along, right? And so the sun is who we think we are. And it's like, you guys, like we can't stay as who we are and move in over the threshold into the new. We just can't. So it's like our individual war. And you know this, right? Like this is a big part of what these souls have been going through over these past years, is this lower war within of like, where you have intuition and then you doubt it and you argue with yourself and you can't figure out what's guidance, what's distraction, what's programming, what's true, you know. And then we've got this war of opposites in our world, right? Like all the isms and all the isms having to fight against each isms, right? And which side of the aisle are you on, you know? And it's like we're all on the same side against this hidden enemy of control energy that's kept this planet in prison. Humanity's got to come across this divide and recognize that the divide and conquer story is so old, right? These control energies that are higher dimensional from us, like fourth, fifth dimensional, but way lower from where you as an advanced soul came from. It's like game over, get off our planet, right? Like enough of your wars and like keeping us in control and through poverty and delusion and lies and mind control, right? I just recently had a past life reading and it was showing this, you know, a country, it was like Middle Ages, early Middle Ages. And it was like how, you know, the warring dominant energy created a conflict within the other country, you know, to weaken this country, to basically manipulate. And this is very Gemini energy, right? Like Gemini is the thinker of how to strategy, right? And its strategy, of course, has a beautiful higher octave of winning and of like overcoming the delusions, overcoming the lies, like outsmarting the enemy. But, you know, manipulation is also a big part of those lower active relationships, right? So it's tricky, but this is what's on the table. But so this picture was like this bigger domination country coming in and starting a revolution, right? I mean, this is an old story. We've seen it again and again, and basically manipulating and bribing through threats this one faction to go against the king, you know, and the other faction and create civil war, so that the country was so weak, and then the other domination energy could just come in and take over, right? And this is like done, you guys. This is so archaic and old. We know this is like draconian, and it's like, oh man, like, so this is this energy of that Venus square Mars that happens right during this Venus retrograde, in the middle of this Venus retrograde, right? And it's like the shift in our conceptual reality and our value system has to do with understanding that we've been pit against each other on each side of the aisle, right? And the evil forces that have been doing that are on both sides of the aisle, right? And keeping us hating each other as a mechanism to control us, because as long as we're fighting each other, we'll never go up against the common enemy. So it's like it's required of humanity to get out from under those stories of us and them. We're so beyond this, right? Except for that there was like intense mind control experiments based on alien technology being used back during World War II in order for Hitler, this is what I've been shown in my intuitive sessions, in order for Hitler to be able to pull off that genocide, or not Hitler, but the forces working behind him, using him. So it's like, you don't think that, you know, almost 100 years later, we're not being mind controlled? Humanity, right? Does this explain some of this division and hatred of the other? Ooh, it's heavy. So this is what this Venus retrograde is about. We got to get out from under this spell. It's really about mind control, apparently. We're figuring this out as we go together here. So now that's powerful. So Venus and the sun come together, square up with Mars, and it's like, hey, you guys, are we here to be divided and fight against each other? Or are we here to unite in love, in a higher octave of love, right? So the sun goes on to make its, so that's what the energy that's going to happen out of this. It's like facing the delusion of division. And then the sun goes into its square with Neptune on the 11th of June. And so the first half of June, we'll be feeling that through almost the middle of June. The first half of June is this like crux of the matter, right? And since Venus turns direct on the 25th, it's kind of like a culmination of the Venus retrograde there as the sun comes into that square with Neptune. And it's like, who do you think you are, right? Are you a little feeder creature that's here to be enslaved and is going to become a robot in a system while they steal your soul? Or are you a particle of God and you better kick into gear and be the consciousness you are, be the rainbow bridge, own it, you know? And it's interesting how it's about information and truth because it's in Gemini, but it's like what we're being asked to do is be beyond information. It's about being in that rainbow bridge, you know, spiritualizing everything that comes in our path. And that's what you came here to do. And that's what this Venus retrograde is giving you an opportunity to do, which also is going to have some, it's like this beautiful revelation energy, but also very disconcerting and uncomfortable places and facing old relationship patterns and deep, dark stories that have gone on for lifetimes, you know, where you've given your power away and all of that. So it's just like the brightest light and the darkest dark is coming out in this situation. Okay, so then on the 25th, June 25th, Venus turns direct. And that happens like so basically almost on the 24th. It's like on the 25th, it turns, and that's at 5 degrees. Now it's interesting, right? So it goes back to 5 degrees. And that's exactly what happens. Now, Mercury's retrograde, which is going to overlap with this. So let's talk about that because Mercury takes a retrograde on the 16th of June. So it's like, oh, are we coming to the end of the Venus retrograde? You know, like get us out of this disconcerting, uncomfortable confusion energy. And then bam, Mercury takes a retrograde in Cancer. So Mercury's retrograde will be in Cancer. Like last time it went over back and forth, you know, from Pisces to Aquarius. But this retrograde for Mercury that starts on June 18th will just stay in Cancer. So here we have our master of reality in Cancer. And it's bringing a lot of energies of like an embodiment and understanding of what the North Node in Cancer has been about. Right? So for our mind to get a sense on what we're doing here, we've got to be able to receive nurturing, come back into a spiritual connection with God, get out of our authoritarian connection that's played out in our relationships, right? Like who's got the power, and get out of that authoritarian lower matrix paradigm and back into a loving communication with God, with the mother, and come back into the children of the garden, basically. So that is the energy there. So we've got, so let's see. So let's look at the beginning of June here, because we've got Mercury enters its retrograde shadow at 5 degrees. So that was what I was saying. It's interesting that Venus's retrogrades back to 5 degrees Gemini. Mercury retrogrades back to 5 degrees Cancer. So there's a powerful energy there, connection with this 5 degrees. 5 is an energy of the spoke on the wheel, right? So you're taking four walls, a square, you know, and then we put the 5 on. It's like, ooh, we're moving, right? It's got an energy of Christ consciousness, of the middle road, and of moving forward in our evolution. So that's a good energy for us. So the very beginning of June, we've got Mercury going into its retrograde shadow at 5 degrees Cancer. We've got Venus square Mars, right? And Venus and the sun square Mars. And then we've got that sun square Neptune on the 11th of June. Then we've got Mercury turning retrograde on June 18th. And so it's like saying that the way forward is going back into reevaluating our conceptual ideas, our conceptual reality around nurturing and love and mother, and bringing up again that Cancer Capricorn axis, right? So Mercury goes to 14 degrees, it turns retrograde at 14 and will go back to 5. So it's going to be really powerful at the end of July and beginning of August when Mercury comes into, and Cancer, it's out of its retrograde, but then it'll be squaring up with Jupiter and Pluto right after their exact conjunction, right? So that's a really potent and powerful time too. And so we've got on June 18th, Mercury's retrograde in Cancer. Gotta go back and get a better connection with the mother and bring that into our everyday conceptual reality, like make it real, right? The North Node is kind of like an idea, conceptual, like it's kind of like, oh yeah. And then this Mercury retrograde in Cancer is like, oh yeah, no, that's absolutely what we have to embody and understand on a cellular level to get going on this evolution. And that's something that I forgot to talk about that starts this whole energy out, is that on the heels of that Venus, the first exact of Venus square Neptune in the first week of May is also when the North Node moves from Cancer into Gemini. So this whole Venus retrograde is about this shift of the North Node. So pretty powerful. Mercury's taking a retrograde in Cancer, right? There's like a very potent energy here with Venus, or the North Node moving into Gemini and Venus's retrograde in Gemini. And it's kind of like, whoa, just all this shifting, but it's like going backwards in order to go forward and back into the old patterns in order to learn. And so this Venus retrograde is really speaking to this nodal shift. And I'm going to have a video out about that soon too. So that's the very first week of May there, Venus square Neptune, and then the nodal shift into Gemini and the North Node in Gemini. The North Node is like, how are we going to get to where we're going? And in Gemini, it's about this overcoming duality, overcoming us and then them, overcoming the war within our mind, overcoming the break between our heart consciousness, the break between our right and left brain, and overcoming the lies and delusions, coming into clarity. So the North Node stays in a sign for about a year and a half. And of course, the nodes shift together, right? So the South Node is moving into Sagittarius. So that's a whole interesting energy, and I will have that video out about that. But the South Node in Sagittarius is speaking to deep grief, unresolved stuff from past lives where we felt like we failed in our mission and our purpose, right? And that has everything to do with the shift in our reality and our conceptual reality and the truths coming out of delusion that the North Node in Gemini is trying to speak to us about. So June, we've got that Mercury going into shadow, Venus and the Sun squaring up with Mars, the Sun squaring up with Neptune, and then Mercury retrograde at 14 degrees. So it like goes almost halfway through Cancer, then turns back. Then Venus turns direct on the 25th of June. So that will be a shift. It's at 5 degrees Gemini, right? So isn't that interesting? Because that means that Mercury and Venus will be very close in like a semi-sextile, 1 degree apart, right? Because actually not, because it turns retrograde at 14. So it's an interesting relationship with them. And so like there's something going on here with this relationship between Gemini and Cancer, maybe speaking to that nodal shift. And so Venus turns direct on June 25th. Then Venus comes into its third and final square with Neptune at the end of July. So it's like, that's when it comes out of its retrograde shadow, is at the very end of July. So this is the chapter we're in right now. And Venus moves over into Cancer on August 7th. Now it's interesting because Mercury moves into Leo. That's going to be a big shift too. Like after Mercury gets out of its retrograde shadow that happens at the end of July. So Mercury gets out of its retrograde shadow on the 26th of July. Venus gets out of its retrograde shadow on the 29th of July. And then they both shift over into new signs. Mercury to Leo, August 4th. That's going to be a huge, we made it out of the Venus-Mercury retrograde, right? And then the 7th is when Venus moves over into Cancer. And Venus is I think Venus will be really happy to get out of Gemini and into Cancer and kind of rest there and reconnect with the mother and heal from this dramatic and traumatic confusion, rearranging. Very important, but also very disconcerting. So that this period of time at the end of July, incredibly potent, because when you get the third hit of transits, like the third hit of this Venus square Neptune, that's when you get the gift of it. That's when it all makes sense. And of course, with Gemini, Neptune, Pisces, nothing's making sense. It's all over the place, And so end of July is a time for that spiritual revelation, to own and establish yourself in that you are only available for the higher octave of spiritual experience on this planet. That means your love relationships and all relationships and coming home into your body, right? Into this experience here of that bigger spiritual self incarnating and choosing and demanding and commanding the higher octave of experience here on Earth. So very powerful time. Now, it's interesting that what also happens on the 6th, so Venus moves into Cancer on the 7th of August. And of course, we taught Mercury on the 4th of August. So that first week of August, ready to shoot off into a whole new reality. And Venus finally hits the North Node, right? So because the North Node moves backwards. So it's at the end degrees of Gemini. And so Venus has to go this whole retrograde before it comes into this North Node. So that's a very powerful moment of realization and everything making sense, maybe lifetimes of stuff making sense when Venus conjuncts the North Node on the 6th of August. So that first week of August, incredibly profound of establishing these new energies, shifting over. And let's not forget that in July, we've got the second exact of Jupiter-Pluto, right? So that whole energy of power, coming to the end of July, will be coming out of the second Jupiter-Pluto conjunction as well. And kind of a whole new paradigm on how we rebuild and break down the structures of our world to better suit us in this new paradigm, in this new energy. So it's we're taking I'm kind of seeing a picture of these retrograde season and this whole energy of Jupiter, Pluto. It's a big step. The pyramids have a 90-degree turn, and the steps of the pyramid represent different levels of consciousness, right? So if you're going to go from one to the next, it's like a big shift. And that's what that kind of, and I kind of see that. I see this chapter we're in of being oh, okay, we're going to establish on a new level of consciousness, perhaps with your help of being the rainbow bridge and commanding and demanding your spiritual octave of experience here. So that's beautiful. We can do work on that together, and I'll be here throughout this process with regular updates. And but let's just talk real quick about the overlap here, because at the end of July, on the 25th of July, Mars in Aries, so Mars retrograde is in Aries, right? So we're finally coming out, Mercury out of shadow, Venus out of shadow, moving into new signs, and then Mars is moving into retrograde shadow, and Mars takes its retrograde on September 9th. And it's interesting because that's right around that time that Mars and Venus will be in a trine, back in a trine. And so Mars is retrograde from September 9th until November 13th in his home sign. So we're having a masculine, a rebirth of the masculine, divine masculine, and a rearranging of the fight and permission to be who we are, and who we are, and what it means to fight, stand up for our truth, very powerful energy of the warrior within, the spiritual warrior within that's willing to stand up for what's right and good and true. Aries has some fire, right? So it's really powerful because Mars comes out of its retrograde shadow January 1st, 2021. That's right after Jupiter and Saturn together move over into the sign of Aquarius. And remember, September is when Saturn turns direct, Jupiter turns direct, and they stay close, right? So Saturn and Jupiter are like kind of running together. They're both going retrograde at the similar time. They're both going direct at the similar time. Retrograde in May, direct in September. So those are our big shifting times. And then in December they go over Aquarius into Aquarius together. So it's not easy year, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. I know it's many months away, but here we are, we're in it. All we can do is move forward, right? So really powerful energy. And so just know that it's just a whole year-long journey that we're in, and luckily we're here together. And I hope you have a wonderful Venus retrograde in Gemini and coming into that spiritual revelation of the truth of who you are, which maybe will be expressed and manifest with that Mars retrograde in its home sign of Aries. So we'll see. I look forward to seeing you soon on the next update. Until then, I'm Adrienne Elise. Namaste.